Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and welcome to today's America Walks webinar, Authentic Community Engagement, Best Practices for Equitable Work. I'm Kelsey Card, Communications Manager at America Walks, and I'm joined here today by Jose Leal, a landscape architect with MIG and director of MIG's Tribal Nation Building Studio, and an America Walks board member. We are lucky to have him. His projects have encompassed everything from complete streets to parks, and he leads a collective whose work focus is to strengthen tribal community cohesiveness and resilience, self-determination, and sovereignty. Jose will be your host and moderator today, and I will be running the technical details behind the scenes. So before we get started, I just want to thank our sponsors, including the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, for making these great events possible for us here at America Walks. And of course, to all of you who attend our webinars regularly and even have donated to make sure this program and our other programs continue to thrive. Thank you. These programs allow us really to directly support local grassroots activism and education, along with making an impact on issues at the federal level as well. So if you like this content and you're a regular guest here, please do consider making a donation towards our webinars and this important work. So quick note about the tech, you should see a control panel like this on your screen. That's where we'll be looking for your questions for our panelists today. So after presentations, we'll kick off a nice Q&A session. So you can enter any questions that come to mind during the presentation right there. And if you would like to use closed captioning today, the link is also in the chat box. So we have three amazing presenters today who have all been working diligently around this topic, fostering and facilitating authentic community engagement in their work. Wafia Murray is a nationally recognized expert in the realm of transportation equity with a background in nonprofit leadership and youth development. She's currently the Better Bike Share Partnership Program Manager for the City of Philadelphia, where she works to address barriers to the use of bike share for individuals with low income and BIPOC communities while increasing equitable access in shared micromobility systems worldwide. John Yee is the Executive Director of Los Angeles Walks. Prior to joining LA Walks in 2019, John was the Advocacy Director for the American Lung Association in California, where he worked on strong tobacco control and air quality policies. John also served as the Interim National Director for Parent Revolution, an education and social justice nonprofit. In this role, he led parent organization campaigns in Texas, Oklahoma, Indiana, and Ohio. And Jeremy Maxson is the Executive Director of the Living Independence Network Corporation, a center for independent living serving 16 counties in Southwest Idaho. Jeremy grew up in a small island community in Southeast Alaska and has used a manual wheelchair since 1989. He serves on the Valley Regional Transit Regional Advisory Council, the Ada County Highway District ADA Advisory Committee, the Idaho State Independent Living Council, various other boards, and is a founding board member of the Idaho Access Project. So today's webinar focuses on what it means to practice and build authentic community engagement with diverse coalitions really as the foundation for driving vital relationships and partnerships. Our presenters will share their best practices for equitable work and striving for inclusive, accessible, connected, and walkable, rollable communities. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. I'm going to turn things over to Wafia now to get us started.
Hello, everyone. Where are my slides? There we go. Hello, everyone. My name is Wafia Murray, and I am coming to you from Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love and sisterly affection, where I work for the City of Philadelphia's Office of Transportation, Infrastructure, and Sustainability, and there I manage the Better Bike Share Partnership work for the City of Philadelphia. So just to share, for those of you who may not be familiar with the Better Bike Share Partnership, or BBSP for short, It is a national initiative. Is a national initiative working to incorporate equity and access and shared micromobility nationally. So we work with operators and systems, operator systems and advocates to really push forward the importance of equity and access for BIPOC communities and individuals with lower income. So BBSP is definitely a partnership. Oh, sorry. Is a partnership, as mentioned before, and the partners include the City of Philadelphia, People for Bikes, and the National Association of City Transportation Officials. And I'm here to talk to you today about best practices and lessons learned for authentic community engagement. And because I work predominantly in bike share, so some of the examples that I will share will be coming from specifically my work within bike share and share micromobility. But even though that's the tool that I'll be talking about often, it's important to understand that these rules for authentic community engagement can be used in any realm, whether it's share micromobility, housing development, any other type of community engagement. It's important to have these this foundation in terms of doing that work. So it's important when doing community engagement to acknowledge history. So as many of you should know, there is, a history of segregation and marginalization within our country and in our communities. There are a lot of systems that have been put in place specifically to keep people down and stop advancement, especially for individuals and communities of color and low income communities, things such as redlining and so forth. So it's important when doing community engagement to acknowledge the role that race and other factors play into this realm, into this field, acknowledging that history, and then working to build a better foundation and a better path forward. So it's important to acknowledge that and to understand that concept as well when you're going into communities, to know what the history is, what the backstory is, to help you move forward adequately. Then the next stage is important to understand building trust and relationships. So as I mentioned, there's, history, and even, in some areas, as we know, still going on, a lot of just history of race and segregation and other things. And so it's important to work on building up that trust and building up those relationships before you start, any type of really authentic community engagement. It's important to build that trust because there's a lot of history of, neglect and misuse, and a lot of communities have been planned for as opposed to being planned with for years. So a lot of times you may come into a community and you may have the best intentions, but because of so much wrong that has been done in the past, or even in some projects currently, it's important to, build up that trust so that you can meet on an even playing field, and so that communities can understand that you're there to do what you say you're going to do, and then you can build that trust in that relationship. So it's important to do. I'm sure some of you have probably heard this analogy before of, looking at community engagement as a relationship. When you're going out and meeting someone, you want to take the time to get to know them, and know who that person is, and build that relationship before you, start trying to really get to work. Part of building that trust and building that relationship is to take some time to understand and identify the needs of the community. Oftentimes, as planners and organizers, we may come into a project very focused on what we need or what we want to get out of that project, right? Like, we want to make sure that we put this bike lane in, or we want to make sure that, we put this program in place because we feel like it'll be able to achieve X, Y, and Z goals. But does that goal also fit in with the goals of the community? Will your program be able to address some of the needs or concerns that the community is facing? So it's important to not just come in with your own goals and your own needs or your own objectives, but to take the time to talk with the communities that you're looking to serve. Figure out, what what's going on in the community, what's the historical context of that community, what are some of the community needs or concerns, that things that may be going on that are meaningful to the community, and then work to build solutions. And sometimes you may find that some of the needs that the community have are, the same needs and priorities that you have as an organization or a planner or advocate, but it's important to sit down and identify needs on both sides, and then come to ideas and solutions to be able to address both equally. Co-creation and co-development is very important. When you're working through a project within a community, you should look at the community, or the community should be involved in your process as, both co-creators and co-developers. You should be able to talk with the communities that you're looking to serve about what your project is going to be, what the outcomes are, and work together to find out solutions, and work together to create, strategies and innovative ways to address problems and build programming, figure out ways to develop together. So it's important to, not just try to come in and do everything yourself, because at the end of the day, when it comes to communities, you're not the expert on that community. The community members are. So it's important to build a process and, of real true co-development and co-creation, where the community partners feel valued, they feel heard, or they, more importantly, not just feel valued, but they are heard, they are respected, and they are really taken seriously in this process, because their information is very valuable. It's also important to make sure that you have diversity within, the group of creators and developers that you have there. So you should have a mix of community members, you should have a mix of diverse voices, backgrounds, experiences, so that you're able to meet the needs of different people, meet the needs of different people. If you have, I know you've heard, if you have a table full of people that all have the same ideas, the same lived experiences, the same outlook, then they're going to come up with the same results, and it's not going to be able to meet the needs of everyone. So if you're really looking to do authentic community engagement and really address equity in a real way, you need to make sure that you have diverse voices, diverse people at the table, and that you have a really true co-creation and co-development process. Additionally, it is important to implement the feedback that you've heard. So a lot of times, people go in and they, do all these listening sessions, or, they attend events and get feedback from the community, but you never really see what they heard implemented, right? So the implementation of feedback is just as important as the initial outreach, right? Because when we talk about building trust and building a relationship in the beginning, it's important for people to understand that you've heard what they told you and presented to you, and that you implemented it in an adequate way. So just to give some examples from our work in Philadelphia with Indigo Bike Share and Better Bike Share Partnership, before rolling out our system, we did a lot of community engagement, held a lot of conversations with community members to find out, what some of the needs are, what are the barriers, how people feel about bike share, and then worked collectively with community members to implement programs and initiatives to help alleviate some of those barriers. So for example, one of the issues that we heard in the beginning was affordability. Making sure that if you want people to use the system, that they need to be able to afford it. So for some people, $17 a month is affordable, but depending on, how your income is set up, it could be a barrier for some. So it's important to have flexible payment options. So we implemented a Access Pass program where anyone with the PA Access card is able to get a monthly membership for $5 a month or $48 a year. So that's just one of the examples of how we heard feedback, heard what the community was saying, partnered with the community to help implement a program to alleviate some of those needs. Some of the other things we heard about were safety and education. People wanted to be able to use bike share, but wanted to be able to use it safely, to know what are the rules of the road, how to travel safely, even just how to use the system correctly. So we implemented bike safety education classes to teach people how to ride a bike, to teach people how to ride safely throughout the city, how to plan out your route in advance, how to adequately use Indigo. And we also offer rides to help show people, on the bike how they can use Indigo, but also how they can use it as a way to meet their everyday needs depending on what they were or what they are. So just reiterating, it's important to implement the feedback that you've heard in a very meaningful and impactful way. The next thing to understand is that communities are powerful. So I stated this earlier, that when it comes to communities, the community members are the experts, and it's important to understand that. A lot of times people come in and feel like, oh, I need to come in this community, I need to empower these community members to do this, or I need to help gather, community members to do this and advocate for this. Communities are powerful. They can advocate for themselves, they can gather for themselves, and they can, speak and do things for themselves, great for themselves and for others. And there are a lot of community partners and leaders that have been, working on a lot of the same ideas and programs and initiatives that you may be working on as planners or advocates or organizations. They've been working on those things for years. Like, you may be coming in and saying you want to, help make this area safer. Well, there's probably a community advocate that has been working to encourage safety in that community for years. So it's important to understand that communities are powerful. They do not need us to empower them. They are already very powerful. It's our duty to come in and work with those community members, identify those community leaders that are willing to work and partner and support this work, and to work collectively, as I mentioned, to work on solving problems and implement feedback. Work on solving problems and implement what was the feedback that was given. And also, it's important to compensate community members for their time and for their effort. Community members are experts. It's the same if you were to hire a consultant to help support you in the work. You would not bring on a consultant and not have that consultant send you an invoice. So it's important to value the time and effort of these community members that are supporting you on this project, and to compensate them adequately for that time. And, lastly, I just want to say, don't be afraid. A lot of times people are often afraid to do really authentic community engagement work, but don't be afraid. You shouldn't be afraid. It can be, sometimes when people go into communities and, community members are like, no, we don't want to work on this project, or people, think about all the work and time that needs to go into it, and they start to feel afraid and they start to back away. But I encourage you, do not be afraid, do not back away. It may seem like a lot in the beginning, but I promise you, if you take the time and the resources to do community engagement adequately and accurately and well, it will be far worth the time. To be able to build those lines of trust and those lines of communication, and to be able to really implement programming that has an impact on not just on your project, but on who you're looking to serve in those communities, is amazing. And that work will span far beyond the lifespan of your project. So don't be afraid. And then also, so there's some additional resources that can be found on the Better Bikes and Partnership site, that for those that are looking for additional insights on how to do authentic community engagement. And if you want to learn more, please check out the Better Bikes and Partnership website, as well as the rideindigo.com website. Thank you, and I will now turn it over to John.
Thank you. Hey, thank you, Wafia. All right, how's everyone doing? I gotta say, I'm impressed. 700 people turning out for a webinar is not usually something that I'm used to. So it's great to see people are still engaged on this, even though I think the world's slowly opening up. But yeah, let's begin. So my name is John Yee. I am the Executive Director for Los Angeles Walks. We are Los Angeles' pedestrian advocacy nonprofit here in Southern California. And so just to begin, a little bit about myself. My pronouns are he and him. I actually live in Koreatown, specifically in Los Angeles. Some of y'all may or may not have visited. Though it's Koreatown, actually the majority of the population are actually Salvadorian Americans. But the reason I wanted to share this is because Koreatown is actually considered one of the more walkable parts in Los Angeles. Yet it has some of the most busiest car throughways throughout the neighborhood. And so for me, it's sort of a really interesting sort of look at how far we have yet to go in Los Angeles when it comes to walkability. But also I want to kind of highlight actually what Thea shared earlier about the importance of history and context. And so, for example, Koreatown, is a result of different immigration patterns. There was 92 civil unrest that happened. And so it's confluence a number of stories and histories. And so history and context is super important when we do community engagement, and understanding that and having a respect for that is super important. So I definitely wanted to just give props for that comment and uplift it a little bit. So generally speaking, what is our mission at Los Angeles Walks? Simply put, we believe that a walkable LA is a just LA. And I think this is worth stating because we're not just here about changing concrete and cement, right? It's not just about rearranging how we build our cities, but creating a city that produces just streets, making sure we have a public transit that serves those most in need and those who need it the most. So it's not just about concrete, it's also about social justice, it's about equity. And so that's why I think this really succinct way of putting our mission is super important to us. So I just want to set the baseline here. I'm not going to read through all the stats, but I think a few things worth noting is that in Los Angeles, every 36 hours, an Angelino is killed in a car crash. The leading cause of death for LA's elementary and middle school children are car crashes. And so again, this isn't just about making sure we have walkable streets, but this also has to do with our lives. It has to do with our physical health, our body, and our community's perception of our streets. If I know that my community streets are highly trafficked, then that changes how I interact with the streets. That changes how I talk to my children about how they should interact with the streets. And so I think, again, it's more than just about concrete, it's about health, it's about community well-being. And so I know today's discussion, we're talking about authentic community engagement. And so I know for my panelists are going to be sharing some great tips and directions on how to do better authentic engagement. So for my presentation, I wanted to actually share with y'all a program that we use, our main program for community engagement, and sort of serve that up to you all as sort of how we do this work. And if you could glean any lessons from them, that'd be great. So before I dive into that, I just want to share with you our theory of change, which I think is important. The theory of change of Los Angeles Walks is pretty simple. It's one of two steps. The first step is we secure safe street infrastructure. I'm sure this might be a challenge, or this probably is a challenge in a lot of cities, but the challenge for safer streets oftentimes is not the street design, it's not getting a certain kind of infrastructure. All the solutions are there, but often the biggest challenge facing communities is the political process in which to secure those resources. So an example I often give in Los Angeles is one speed hump can often take you over a year to secure. It requires you to petition the city, it requires you to talk to your neighbors and collect signatures, it requires to work on an English-only application that which you have to translate if you don't speak English or have someone translate for you. So there's a lot of bureaucratic processes and systems that are into place that really do not benefit communities of color, immigrant communities, and monolingual communities. And so what we do at Los Angeles Walks in our theory of change is we support communities as they navigate city systems and engage power, whether it's the bureaucracy, whether it's a city council member, whether it's agencies, to secure life-saving infrastructure. So things like speed humps, stop signs, road diets, crosswalks, flatter sidewalks. And so that's the first step we do. We secure safe street infrastructure by supporting communities as they organize and sort of pressure the city for safe street infrastructure. The second step is that as we do this sort of literally block by block community organizing work, we leverage that kind of energy, that kind of campaign to do systems change. So through political appointments, through local elections, our community members secure positions of power so that they can end up influencing long-term design. So on the bottom left is a town hall that actually we had for a city council election. On the bottom right is the LA Pedestrian Advisory Committee. And we're pretty active in making sure that our community members get appointments to that. Some of our community members have even run for local office, for local neighborhood council. And so that's the kind of systems change that we believe you need to do in companionship with changing infrastructure. And so for our theory of change, it's just 2 steps, but we see this as a yin and a yang, right? You cannot do one without the other. You cannot fix local infrastructure without changing the larger system that produces these awful streets. But at the same time, you cannot change a larger system unless you are actually uplifting and working with communities that are most impacted by those unsafe streets. So for us, this theory of change is sort of guides almost all the work that we do as an organization, and is central to sort of how we do our community engagement. So which then takes me to our program that I mentioned earlier about like how we do our engagement. So for the past 3 years, we've developed something called a Safe Street Promotora Educator Program. Some of y'all may recognize the word promotora. It's used often, most likely in the public health sense, and it's the idea is that you have a fellow neighbor or a peer who understands systems, understands resources, and bring those resources to the community, right? It's not a professional like advocate like me, for example, or an organizer or someone from the public health department that comes into the community. It is a community member, they themselves, who is given the resources, the training, and paid and compensated to navigate within their own community and support their community. And the same way, we wanted to build a similar system in public transportation. As I shared earlier, the biggest struggle with us is not finding the solution, it's navigating broken systems and city bureaucracies. And so in the same way, our promotoras are trained to navigate city systems, leverage their relations with city council members to then engage city bureaucracies to secure safe street infrastructure. And so these 2 are actually contracted promotoras that we have. I should note that these that is Gabby Segovia and Nancy Sid. And so they've actually helped us build a training program. They've been training their fellow community members. And just a few weeks ago, we certified another sort of dozen of Safe Street promotoras. It's important to note that we pay them for their work. We compensate them at an equitable rate. They are not volunteers, right? They're not doing this out of the kindness of their heart. They're doing this because A, the community is needed, but B, also because we consider this a professional consultant in a way to do this work. And so this is how we do our community engagement, right? It's not professional staff or organizers coming into spaces. Instead, community members are creating their own spaces and sharing their resources and their capacities. And so for us, this is sort of an exciting approach to authentic community engagement. It's rooted in the community and it's led by the community. And certain examples of trainings we do is everything from utilizing Google Maps, Google Earth, and GIS mapping to make a case for safe streets. How to do walk audits is another training that our promotoras provide to others in the community. Engaging elected officials, understanding the built environment, understanding the engineering behind the built environment. Stuff like that are some of the topics that we go through. And I do want to add this point, because oftentimes in the context of community engagement, and especially for a program like this, we often hear the word capacity building. And I think it's a word that's used pretty often. And I always like to ask people, when you say capacity building, the follow-up should always be for whom? And the reason I frame it like this is because oftentimes when we say capacity building, it means we need to build a certain community. Oftentimes it's immigrant communities, non-English speaking communities, or communities of color. We need to build their capacity so they can engage people in power, you know, oftentimes white, oftentimes men, oftentimes dominant English speaking. And for me, that is an unfair sort of set of expectations to place just on the community, but not on elected officials. And I'll give you an example. You know, I'm Korean American. I was born in the States, but in the Korean American community, an app that's very commonly used, I know anyone in here that's Korean probably will recognize this, is an app called Kakao Talk. It's a chat app that's used very popularly among the Korean American community. And so I've seen firsthand Korean Americans in K-Town especially organized through that app. So within that context, the capacity is there, right? We don't have to build any capacity, it's already built. But whenever there's an issue that has to do with city council or the board of supervisors, oftentimes the question is, you have to learn how to use Twitter. You have to learn how to speak English to go call in to a city council meeting and testify. You need to know how to use Zoom. And so for me, there might be some truth to that, but at the same time, we need to ask ourselves, how do we build the capacity of power so they can engage communities authentically as well? I think it's a two-way street. It has to go both ways. And so if there's anything that y'all leave from my presentation specifically, is that capacity building is a two-way street. We cannot put the burden simply on community members, but we also should put the burden of responsibility on elected officials and city government as well. So I just wanted to make sure I added that point. And so going back to our theory of change, it is through this sort of model of organizing. Within the past year, these are just a few successes that we've seen. Again, going back to the theory of change, step one, win safe street infrastructure. We actually got secured almost $100,000 in funding for a crosswalk that's going to be installed on Fig and L in the community of Wilmington in Los Angeles. It's a harbor community, and it's an important intersection for pedestrians between the community, a major college, and a lot of sort of community events. And on top of that, we've also secured a safe street bus stop. I'm sorry, a sheltered bus stop in one of the communities right next to senior housing. So again, these are two examples of infrastructure being secured not by staff, not by professional advocates, but by community members who have the tools themselves to navigate city systems. Going back to the second sort of step of our theory of change, which is building a larger movement. This is one example. This is the agenda for the LA Pedestrian Advisory Committee. You'll see here Nancy and Gabby are actually appointees to the Pedestrian Advisory Committee. If you recall, they were promotoras. And so they were actually appointed by the city. They now are sitting members of the PAC. They help sort of vote and move the strategic direction of the PAC. And so for us, this is a clear example of building long-term power. Again, you can change the local infrastructure, but you have to also change the larger system that produces that infrastructure. So yeah. And with that, I'll just conclude with this. This is a quote by Peatonito. He's from Mexico City. He was actually one of our fellows, but he does a lot of really cool public demonstrations for pedestrian rights. And a quote that he has that I always love to share is this, and I'll just read it out loud. The pedestrian is nobody in the city. He or she has been forgotten by authorities and our own citizenry. The curious and paradoxical thing is that we are all pedestrians at some moment. As such, we have forgotten ourselves. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me and can you see my screen? There we go.
All is great. Yes, thank you.
Okay, super. Really great information from Wafia and John. And I'm really gonna try and add on to what both of them talked about and recommended, but from a disability perspective. My name is Jeremy Maxson. I'm the Executive Director of the Living Independence Network Corporation in Boise, Idaho. We're a center for independent living, one of 3 regional centers for independent living that serve Southwest Idaho. And there's about 400 centers for independent living that exist across the United States that have a deep and rich history in the civil rights movement around disability, justice, and rights and inclusion. And today I want to talk about, just real briefly, authentic community engagement and disability. And I want to share specifically some work that we've done with a small project in Boise, in Idaho, called the Idaho Access Project, and how that project got started and why, and what our first project was, what we found, and then how that kind of feeds into this conversation about authentic community engagement. The first thing I want to do is make sure I'm correctly using my PowerPoint. Okay. The first thing I want to do is just talk about independent living, and I'm hoping that my slide is moving forward. Independent living is a really big deal in the disability community, and independent living is a philosophy, a movement, and a program. As a philosophy, independent living really is about consumers, individuals with disabilities directing our own lives. You might hear the mantra, nothing about us without us. Decisions that affect our lives, we should be involved in those decisions, and we should be directing our own lives. And that seems really obvious for most people, but when you think about a lot of folks with significant disabilities who have ended up in institutions and those sorts of settings, directing your own life can be really difficult, if not impossible. So we really believe in that philosophy. As a movement, the disability rights movement is something that really came out of the civil rights movement of the 60s and the 70s. And there's a deep, long history of civil rights movement around disability in the United States, creating community, trying to create more justice and equity and inclusion for people in all aspects of society. And as a program, independent living really is focused on centers for independent living around the country that help people, empower people to live as independently as they want in their own communities rather than in kind of institutional care. A lot of this culminated in the passage of the most comprehensive civil rights legislation in the United States, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is a photo on the left of a group of individuals in 1978 in Denver, Colorado, protesting the inaccessible bus system, which was eventually changed and I believe became the first accessible bus system in the country. And then the photo on the right is of what's called the Capitol Crawl. And these are folks with disabilities crawling up the steps of the Capitol, protesting in advance of the ADA, in the belief that that ADA was about to not be passed, and so there was a big protest. But again, this, like Wafia said, like understanding the history and where folks have come from and the structural inequalities that people have experienced over generations is really, really important, because if you don't know where you came from, you don't really know, it's hard to know where you're going and where you're at. Okay, and just a comment about disability in general in the United States. Disability is the largest, essentially minority group in the country that any of us can become a member of. Although you're not invited to become a member of this group, if you are, you will be surrounded by caring and supportive people to make sure that you live the life that you want. But a lot of people in the United States are affected by disability. 1 in 5 adults in the United States. At least 21% of households have 1 or more people with a physical limitation. More than half of all newly built homes will have at least one person with a disability living in them over the next 50 years. And then slightly more than half of people with disabilities between 18 and 64 have a travel limiting disability. So this impacts housing, transportation, all sorts of things. So it's important that we know what's going on when it comes to disability and access. So in Idaho, a small group of us got together and created what's called the Idaho Access Project. And we did it out of this frustration of constantly running into these kind of barriers, whether it be in construction zones or e-scooters on sidewalks or inaccessible information like websites that aren't accessible or not having access to ASL interpreters, things like that. This is actually a photo of one of our founding board members, Diana Willis, who uses a guide dog to navigate. And I learned about her through a news story I saw where she was being interviewed about her difficulties getting through construction zones. So we all got together, had a conversation, didn't really know one another, but we're like, we're gonna do this. We're gonna start this project and we're gonna work on this stuff in a proactive way. So the first thing we did was we thought, neighborhoods are really where it's at. That's where we live, it's where we work, it's where we play. People engage at a neighborhood level. There's power at the neighborhood level when it comes to community organizing. And so we thought, let's engage one of the developers in this neighborhood in Boise, and let's do what we call a neighborhood access review. And this is basically a cross disability group of individuals who we got together. We rolled through an entire boundary of a neighborhood association, and we categorized all the stuff that we found were really barriers, whether it was from effective communication or physical barriers. You can see on this slide, there's a photo of a step from a senior assisted living center to a nature trail with one step. And it's like, why would you put that step there? And you can see splitters in the center photo in a traffic circle that Diana was trying to navigate through. And you could see it would cause a wheelchair to have to veer out into the street a bit more. So these sorts of barriers were really rampant throughout the entire community, and we compiled all these. One of the things that we found that was really alarming when we did this kind of on-the-ground review were the installation of bike ramps near roundabouts to get cyclists off the street, kind of in a safer environment before they got back on the road. The design of this feature, although, resulted in these kind of on-ramps with no tactile markers. So folks tracking with a white cane, who are blind, really easily ended up kind of tracking right onto the street without any indication that they were like in the middle of the road in oncoming traffic, which is really concerning. And we were asking ourselves, how is this happening? Like, I mean, it's 2021. The ADA has been around for a really long time. Why do these kinds of things still happen? And we see these design flaws all the time. And we realized after we looked at all the assessments we did that, you know, the laws and guidelines don't always result in the outcomes that we need. That the ADA is really a minimum standard and not the ceiling. That user experience is really, really important. And that oftentimes, you know, especially designers and planners and developers and things, you know, we don't know what we don't know if we're not talking to people in the community. And then systems change is really critical, but it's really all about people and relationships as well. So out of that, and for this presentation, I wanted to talk about some best practices that we kind of naturally kind of came out of this. And I'm sure this is not all inclusive, and it speaks specifically to designers and kind of city agency folks and people reviewing plans and developments and things like that. But, you know, understand your power. Like, you know, we talk a lot about the power of community, and there is a tremendous amount of power in community, like John and Wafia said. But it's also important for designers and cities to understand your power in that you're not just approving something on paper, but this actually gets poured into concrete, and that concrete can last for 100 years. So if a neighborhood isn't built in an accessible way, we're kind of built out of it for 100 years. Know that the little things add up. You know, it's one thing that a curb ramp might not be designed the right way, or a path doesn't have good connectivity or accessibility. But when you really start to add up these little things, the compounding effect can be really significant and really a deterrent for people to be out living their full lives. I'd say find disability allies and build relationships. Wafia posted something in the chat about this, about champions. Really what you want to do is go find somebody in the community, either at a Center for Independent Living or some other organization, and find somebody you're comfortable with and build a relationship with them. Find some folks in chairs, find some folks who are deaf, find some folks who are you know, blind or low vision with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Get to know them, build relationships with them, and learn from them. It's really, really, really important. And you don't want to do that, you know, in the middle of a project. You want to do that now. And trust building takes time, and there are definitely some bumps and bruises along the way. You know, you may be talking to people who haven't really been listened to or heard at all in their entire lives, and there may be a lot of built-up anger and frustration, and that may come out in this process. But, you know, just stay true to and authentic to kind of what your goal is if you're a builder or planner or something, and you know, and just persevere through that and understand kind of that history and where people are coming from. Understand that intersectionality is really important. You know, I'm a white guy in a wheelchair, but, you know, folks, you might find somebody in a chair who is blind or has a developmental disability, or is deaf, or is low income, or a person of color, and all of these kind of intersections change and create unique experiences for people. And those are really important to understand and consider. Make materials accessible, not just in language, but also for effective communication. ASL is really important for folks who are deaf, making sure that digital material is made in an accessible and screen reader format, things like that. You'll get better engagement from the disability community. Ground truth with your users, super important. This is what we did in our neighborhood when we did this assessment. And you've got to get out there with people, and you've got to experience what users are experiencing on the ground, so you can really understand what folks are talking about and why issues that are brought up are relevant, should be addressed. And build in opportunities for review and discussion in design planning. You really have to be intentional about making sure these conversations are happening, and at points where the input can make a difference. And then finally, I would say advocate for inclusive design. Be somebody who is bringing up some recommendations for, that go above and beyond the ADA, and try and include those in designs and neighborhoods to make them as universally accessible as possible and as inclusive as possible. But out of all of these, the one thing that I would say is the most important is really the finding and building relationships and trust building. And I would encourage folks to find people in your community to make those connections, and it gets easier from there. So those are the things I wanted to leave folks with. I'm really excited about this panel. The stuff that's been brought up has been fantastic, and I'm looking forward to the questions. So I'll turn it back. I'll stop sharing and I'll turn it back to Jose.
Yes, thank you everybody for that presentation there. What I'm really taking away from this is that true authentic engagement is really community organization. I think these presentations really show that importance to really go deep in the community, and just seeing these presentations, the work you're all doing, I'm really nice to get inspired to really see that social change happening and really that justice and equity being brought to life. So with that, I want to kick it off with some questions here that I've been kind of collecting as we went. The first one is really one question that I have is, when we're creating this space for community engagement to happen, it really requires a safe place for everybody to meet. What kind of considerations and recommendations would you kind of offer that are required to help lay that groundwork for authentic engagement when it comes to places to meet? Anybody?
Should we just jump right in? Yeah, I would say, if I was, somebody with a city that was gonna, and I'm interested in what Fia has to say about this, but like, if I was a engagement person with the city, I would probably ask that question of the folks that I was hoping to engage. So kind of that co-creation, and really drill into like what are things that are going to prevent people from attending, participating, sharing, finding their voices in that environment, and try and be really upfront and have that conversation as a co-creation activity is the first thing I think I would do.
I think you're muted there. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. Sorry, I was muted, y'all. So yes, I agree. I think in terms of figuring out, the best place to meet, or logistics like that, definitely connect with your community champions and those who you're working with in the community to identify places and times that are convenient for those members. You don't want to schedule a meeting at 1 o'clock in the afternoon if the community members you're working with aren't getting off of work until 5, and then even then some of them may need to pick up kids from daycare or get dinner ready. And then you also don't want to host the meeting, downtown Center City when the community that you're working with is, miles and blocks away. So you want to find a place also that, is a common place and a place that the community members and the community you're working with feel comfortable meeting and gathering.
I would just add to that list, when you're looking at a space, make sure for those who are undocumented, they can't enter buildings that often require documents. That's been a challenge for some of the city meetings. So making sure they're in spaces that are sort of neutral and people feel safe for it. Childcare, I think that's important as well. Are you providing childcare at the event? Sometimes parents can't leave their children. So is there someone who can take care of the kids? Translation as well. Oftentimes I've been in meetings where it's like, no, it's not simultaneous translations. People can often get lost in that. And also making sure you have a good translator. Sometimes you have translators who don't know the jargon, skip words. I've seen this happen during city council meetings and LA Metro board meetings. And so making sure we have good translation. And then finally, food. I think that's also important as well. Are people being going there? Do they have food? Can they eat? Can the children eat? So I think those things I would add to the list.
Well, thank you. That's really good information. So I'm gonna start reading more questions here. So what do we do when when a portion of the community wants something, but the slight majority may not want it?
So I'm sorry, were you saying when a specific person wants it, but the majority of the community is saying no?
Correct. Yeah.
So for me, in my experience, and we've come across this with, the work I do with bike share. Like we may want to put a station in the area and feel like it's a great spot. We have people that are interested, but the majority of the community is like, no, we don't feel like it's a good fit. And we say, okay, we understand. And, maybe it's not a good time right now. We'll try again, maybe next year. Or, maybe we can work to help address some of the concerns that you have for why a station shouldn't be here. But at the end of the day, if the community says they don't want it right now, it's not a good fit, then we won't move forward. And then, hopefully we'll try to revisit at a later time, and maybe things will change, and maybe you can kind of work to drill out some of the pinch points that are causing the hesitation for the program. But yeah, if the community is saying that they don't want it, then for us, we don't move forward, and I wouldn't recommend moving forward. And I know that is difficult for some people to hear because, you're working on a project and, you feel like it's the best thing. But what good is implementing something in the community if you're implementing something and your goal is to provide an additional resource to the community, but the community doesn't want it and isn't going to use it, then how helpful or useful is that product going to be?
Okay, good.
I love this question because there's an assumption built into it if you think about it, which is, what do you do? One person wants it, but the larger group doesn't want it. Because by asking that question, you're assuming that you as an organizer need to make that decision. And that's not really your decision to make, to decide who is right, who is wrong, who gets more attention, who doesn't. And I think if you're a good community organizer, you would have already built a space where those community members come in, they have a decision-making process in which whatever comes out of it is sanctioned as a group. And I think as a good community organizer, you need to build that space before you make decisions. Because what happens is if you don't build that kind of space and make decisions, they're going to look to you, whether you're a city official or the organizer coming in from the nonprofit, to make those decisions for them. And at the end of the day, that's not my decision to make. So I think that's why setting the table and setting expectations amongst community members from the beginning about this is how we make decisions, this is how we see each other, and we come to an agreement. Like that is so fundamental in establishing that kind of foundation. And if you don't do that, you'll end up hitting these questions where the hot potato kind of falls into your hands.
Yeah, thank you, John, for that.
I just want to add that, and also setting expectations with individuals. So if we work with a lot of individuals in how to advocate for themselves and how to create systems advocacy. And we know that we don't always get everything we want. And sometimes we just kind of maybe get a little bit of what we want. And so making sure you're bringing people along with the reality of what it means to organize and try to create change. It doesn't always end up necessarily exactly how we want it. And so it's setting expectations so people don't walk away and kind of abandon the work altogether, I think is really important, because there are wins, but not always, right?
Yeah, well, thank you, Jeremy. Sorry for interrupting you. So another question here, maybe for you, Wafia, is what kind of advice would the presenters give to the city staffers who want to support community organizing from within a city organization?
Supporting community organizing within the city organization. So I work for a city, as I mentioned, I work for the city of Philadelphia, and so I feel like everything that I mentioned would apply to whether you're working within a city organization, out of an advocacy organization, etc. And if anything, working with a city organization, I feel like you have even more of a responsibility, because if you work for the city, you are working to service those residents and individuals in your city. And so you really want to make sure that you're doing your engagement authentically, and that you're meeting the needs, and that you're applying the equity lens to that work. And just taking the time. I know oftentimes with city With cities, you have a lot of different projects. You often have, more projects or more work than you have people to actually do the projects and implement it. So I totally understand and empathize with that. But, it's important to just, when you're doing this work, to prioritize the time that needs to go into this community engagement. And as I, mentioned on my last slide of like that, don't be afraid piece, that is really important, because I know a lot of people, they feel there's so much work to do, it's so much, I don't know how we're going to get it done, how are we going to do it, and they shy away from it. But I will tell you, it's a lot less work to take the time and do the community engagement well from the beginning than to try to implement a project and then try to go in afterwards for a project that didn't work and then try to build that relationship and build that community engagement, because it's way more difficult, because you've already ruined the trust, right? You've already burnt bridges and now you're trying to rebuild something. So yeah, so that would be my advice that I definitely give. Like, take the time to do it effectively the first time, do it as early and often as possible, and continue to do that loop and build that relationship. And trying to go backwards, it's not worth it.
Okay. And then John, someone said you had a great point about capacity building. And they say, coming from a city government employee, how do you recommend starting that process when existing community systems are stretched to their capacity?
Yeah, I kind of want to answer the question before as well. It might kind of dovetail into this, which is what can cities do better with community engagement? And there's a number of things I would recommend. But one thing for sure is revisit how y'all are doing contracting for projects. So much of the way the contracting process is built for large planning firms that oftentimes, many of the times, are not from the communities where their contractors do the work, or for developers. And rarely are they really fashioned for nonprofits to do the engagement, for community members to get compensated. And so I would really rethink on how y'all build some $1 million contracts. And then when you include a community engagement component, make sure that it is actually well funded, that it's accessible for community members. So that's one thing I would say. And as for how to just build the community capacity of departments, I mean, just think about who are the target communities that you are not reaching. List those communities out, figure out what tools they use, whether it's social media, whether maybe it's in person. And then I think just start from there and then start from there and start creating tools within the agency.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple more here. So another question, when hiring community ambassadors or community champions, how do you go about identifying those folks if you are unfamiliar with the community?
Yeah, I can answer this one. So I have a kind of a two-part answer for this, and maybe I should have mentioned this during my presentation. So community ambassadors are amazing, and I definitely recommend them. Hiring experts from the community to help support you in doing this work. But the key word there is to help support you, right? So don't assume that the community ambassadors are going to do all of your community engagement work, and that you, as the project manager or the city or operator, can just hand it all off to these community experts to just bring you all this work themselves on the plate. That's not the case. They're to help you build those connections and help you, be a part of that co-creation process. But you also have a role to play in the community engagement process. And so part of that role is ways to identify these community ambassadors is to really do your research, right, about the community that you're looking to serve. A lot of times people are doing projects in communities that they've never even visited. They've never been to, they've never gone, they've never, walked around. And it's like, take your time, go visit the area, walk around. Visit some of the, community resources. Talk to some of the people in the community. Stop by some of the stores, some of the landmarks, some of the churches, some of the, corner stores, hair shops, rec centers, libraries. Take the time to. That's part of that, history piece as well. Take the time to learn about, the history and the landscape of the community that you're looking to work in. And as you're doing those visits and having conversations with people, oftentimes a lot of the names will pop up. Like, sometimes we hear the same names at different stores, like, oh yeah, you should talk to such and such because they live here and they're, they've been working on an initiative similar to this. So take the time to do that. You know, Google is great, but Google isn't everything. So I would recommend, you know, taking the time to like go out in the community and have some conversation. That'll help you also to identify some of those people that you may want to work with and through that. So that would be my recommendation.
Okay, well, we're coming up in time here, but I'm going to continue asking some questions. So this was for all you there. It says, can you talk a little bit about internal engagement and what happens with staff to prepare for the external community engagement?
I can share a bit about that. And so I would say, so definitely, like I mentioned, doing your research, and you know, as you're planning for the community meeting, you should also be, you know, co-planning and co-creating with those community partners that you're working with, to make sure that, you know, obviously location and timing is something that we talked about earlier, but also content, right? So making sure that your content that you're sharing is digestible, to who you're presenting it to. A lot of times, you know, as planners and stuff, we talk in this jargon of like, we use a lot of acronyms because I tend to do it myself. So I had to, you know, check myself, use a lot of acronyms, we use a lot of jargon. You know, we use a lot of language and terms that, you know, if you're not in this work day to day, you may not be familiar with. So, you know, sometimes when we're doing a presentation, we actually run the presentation through to our community partners to say, hey, this is what we're looking to present. How does this sound to you? Or what we're trying to convey coming through effectively. And also, you know, think about ways to make it fun and interactive as well. So that's some of the things we go through internally when planning and preparing. And then food, I heard Don mentioned food earlier, someone mentioned food earlier, and I'm like, yes, that is an important one, especially if you're having a nighttime meeting or whatever, make sure you have some food or refreshment. So, yeah.
I'd add the also a debrief is really important. So, you know, making sure that there's that feedback loop so that people know, like, oh, you know, let's talk about the outcomes, what we heard, make sure that everybody's on the same page about what was heard and recorded, and then identify things that, you know, work well, that didn't work well, and that you could quickly make those commitments to adjust those engagement processes moving forward. And then people, you know, people don't leave that meeting, and, you know, maybe it's a month until your next meeting or check-in, right? And they don't leave that like, oh, that really wasn't working, people didn't hear. You can kind of nip that in the bud quickly, learn, get consensus, and then move forward, and everybody maintains that kind of level of energy and commitment.
Yeah, I would just add one thing that I think is important for at least us as a team internally to do when doing this external work is acknowledging the personal in the work. And it just not so happens, but a lot of the organizers in the space are, you know, organizers of color, you know, are queer organizers who are organizing their own communities and working with their own communities. And oftentimes, many times, it's very difficult to extricate your personal self with the community that you see in front of you. Those are elders, those are people that, you know, you're familiar with. And so if you have a team that's diverse, and you should, if you're going to do community organized work in this kind of regard, acknowledge that kind of tension that happens and give space and time for community members to be able to like grieve or mourn if they need to, because I think that's important.
Okay, well, once again, I really thank you three for your wonderful presentations, of your time, and for these nice responses to these questions. I think at this point, I'll turn it back to Kelsey to wrap us up.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was really valuable. Thank you for your insights and expertise on this really important topic. And Jose, thanks for leading us through this discussion so thoughtfully. And just appreciate all of you for being so engaged and present. There were a ton of questions, and I think it really sparked deeper dialogue and invaluable takeaways. So just want to thank our sponsors again today. And if you enjoyed today's discussion, please consider playing a part in keeping more content like this coming your way by making a donation today if you can. We suggest around $15 to $20, but anything really does help. and goes a long way towards improving our work in this program. So you will find a donation link in the chat box if that's something you're interested in, and in the follow-up emails. So normally this is the part where I will tell you about next month's webinar, but we're actually going to be taking the month to plan and brainstorm some new and exciting content for you all. So we'll be back in September. Feel free to give us particular feedback on the webinar content. You know, what do you want to see more of with the series? What do you think you could do without? You can include some of these points in your survey feedback today. We really do look at that and value and pay attention to your input. So on that note, I hope you enjoy the rest of your summer. Thank you again, everyone, for being here, and for our guests for their precious time today. It really means a lot. Have a great day, and we will see you soon.